of all the past summits have taken on greater value, meaning, and importance today because their focus was on the necessity of think tanks to rethink their traditional business models and their research agendas. That imperative is now more urgent since the winds of change have intensified and accelerated. Only those think tanks that are smarter, better, faster, tech savvy, and agile will weather this storm. It is our obligation in terms of the think tanks that have essentially already prepared for the future. We need to help those think tanks throughout Asia to be prepared to survive the storm so they can continue to serve in the post-COVID era. We are holding, the TTCSP are holding 7 regional summits, 1 forum, and 1 global summit. All will take place before mid-December. I invite all of you to come to join us for the Global Summit on November 13th. We already have approaching 250 people for the summit, and we just sent out the invitation last week. So we're expecting over 500 people to attend the summit. Due to the time and digital constraints of this platform, I asked all the panelists, speakers, and participants to respect the following rules of the road. Please stick to your time allotted in your segment of the program. You will be notified twice, once at the 2-minute mark, so you know that the end is approaching, and then your mic should be shut off at the conclusion of your presentation. We asked all participants to shut off your mic and video now, during the program, and all panelists to shut off their mics and video when their panel has finished. The linguistic diversity in the region and financial and technical constraints made it impossible to provide simultaneous translation for this meeting. The meeting will be conducted in English. Panelists, given the severe time constraints, I urge you to be brief and refrain from making advertisements for your organization and focus on providing ideas and recommendations for how we can best respond to the crisis. There are close to 200 policymakers, senior executives, and scholars from think tanks, IGOs, corporations, and philanthropists who are here today and who are seeking solidarity and support so they do not have to face the daunting challenges that have been created by the COVID crisis. I urge each and every panelist to dig deep and show us the way out of this crisis. In every crisis, there is an opportunity, and this is a moment for think tanks to demonstrate their leadership and why think tanks, ideas, and experts matter, especially in a time of crisis. Let's begin the program. We have a spectacular group of panelists and speakers from leading think tanks in the Asia-Pacific region to share their observations and recommendations with us now. And so I turn the program over to Adrian. Adrian Cristobal is the chair of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia and former secretary of the Department of Trade and Industry in the Philippines. Adrian?
Thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction. I also thank you for putting this program together. for your important contribution in nurturing this global community of think tanks. Indeed, the pandemic has exposed the stark reality of social and economic inequality within societies and across countries, the unequal access to public health, and the digital divide, as well as the powerful impact on political institutions and systems. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Mr. Jung-Min Sung, who is delivering the opening keynote of this regional and global impact of COVID-19. Jung-Min Sung is a partner at the McKinley Global Institute. He leads their research teams in China, working on global as well as China-focused themes. Jung-Min, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim and Adrian, for wonderful opportunity and introduction. So it is my honor to join the summit again, this time virtually. Hope we can do offline sessions again next year. So COVID-19 is a humanitarian challenge, and our lives are significantly affected by the public health crisis as well as economic recession. I'm in Shanghai. I personally went through 14-day quarantine process at a government-nominated hotel. And I certainly don't want to repeat that experience. And there is a lot of uncertainty about the future, and no one has the crystal ball. That means the role of think tanks to provide independent and fact-based perspectives matters more than ever. And I hope my opening remark can be a helpful reference to our discussion today. So let's talk about the new normal or next normal. There's a lot of debate on how the next normal may look like. Some say it'll be a completely different world because COVID changed everything. And others say, we'll go back to the beautiful old world as soon as we develop vaccine because people don't change easily. Our view is that COVID is more of an accelerator or an amplifier of existing trends. So the new normal may not be completely new, but we may see a future fast-forwarded by COVID. And I'm in Shanghai, I'm in China. Given that China is the first in and first out of the COVID-19 crisis at the moment, let me build on observations in China and then discuss 5 accelerating trends in China and also in the global economy. So first trend is digitization. So over the past months, we have seen a lot of interesting news about booming e-commerce, live streaming, digital entertainment, on-demand delivery, and so on and on and on. To me, it was not surprising at all because digitization has been happening around the world over the past decade for a while. Anyways, what was really surprising was the digitization of less digitized part of the economy because of COVID. So, for example, healthcare. It is not so much digitized sector globally, but during the COVID, it became really popular because patients didn't want to go to the hospital, hospitals didn't want to take patients, and government approved a new reimbursement scheme for telemedicine in China. And doctors registered in a telemedicine platform surged more than 30 times. And similar story for real estate, which is also not so much digitized sector. The usage of virtual reality showroom services on a digital platform surged more than 30 times. So a lot of acceleration happened in B2C area, but that is also happening in B2B as well. So so we conducted a global executive survey, and 67% of the executives say that they accelerated automation and AI since the start of the COVID. So the digitization of the economy will have substantial impact on productivity and innovation, and it's certainly an important topic for think tanks to study further. So that's the first trend. Second trend is regionalization, especially in the context of supply chain. So in short, China has been becoming more Chinese and Asia has been becoming more Asian. So 80% of American companies surveyed in China say that they are not relocating out of China, despite some of the noise about geopolitical situation, because majority of their business model in China is to serve the Chinese market, so-called in China for China. And when when some of them say they relocate value chain, they tend to pick other parts of Asia. And if you look at Asia in general, regionalization trend has been, increasingly prominent. So intra-regional flows has been accounting for 60 to 70% of trade, capital, and people flows in China. And globally, supply chain resilience, is becoming an important agenda for executives, and 93% of executives, according to our survey, said that they will increase supply chain resilience. So the regionalization and reconfiguration of value chains will have significant impact on the regional economic development in Asia, which is another important topic for think tanks. The third trend is rising competitive intensity, so-called superstar effect. So if you look at sports industry or entertainment industry, top performers like Tom Cruise or Tiger Woods make the majority of the income. Similar situation happens in a corporate world as well. So globally, top 10% of companies account for 70 to 80% of economic profit. And COVID seems to have accelerated the trend. Digital savvy companies, Asia companies are gaining more share and emerging stronger. And by the way, Jim just said that the effect also exists in the think tank world as well. So we analyzed the total return to shareholder performance to date for global top 5,000 companies and found out that there is a very big divergence across different sectors. So commercial airline and travel sectors, for example, they lost value by about 20 to 30%, whereas healthcare sector, tech sector, they increased their value by 10 to 30%. And this means, right? So the superstar impact means that it may deepen inequality in the society. So if you happen to be part of this strong sector and companies, you'll be in a good shape. If not, you'll get a much bigger hit, especially the ones employed in small and medium enterprise. So, certainly this is an important agenda for all of us to pay attention to. So that's the third trend. Fourth trend is about the change in consumer behavior. Basically, customers are becoming more prudent, and Chinese households are known for high savings rate for more than a household savings rate of more than 30%. And they are becoming even more prudent. So the deposit balance in China to date has increased by 10%, whereas consumer credit balance has decreased by 18%. So consumers are thinking harder on what they buy. And this is a global trend. And we see change in consumer behavior around the world as well. And that creates some discontinuity and shock to loyalty. And according to our global consumer survey, 50 to 90% of consumers in different economies say that they have tried new shopping behavior, using new channels and products and services. So the change in consumer behavior, again, another very, very important topic for us to study. So the final trend, the fifth trend, is about very strong public-private collaboration. And depending on countries, the context can be different. In China, we saw significant step up of private sector. So for example, I used QR code in Alipay this morning to enter my office building, and the implementation of the QR code at a national scale would have been impossible without the contribution from tech platforms. In other parts of the world, we see public sector stepping up. So if we compare the size of fiscal stimulus today with 2008 package, it is about 4.5 times larger. So governments are implementing various policy measures to maintain household economic welfare and help companies survive the crisis. So we expect that there could be stronger public private collaboration going forward. So this slide was a brief overview of the trends, the accelerating trends that we have observed. And there are plenty of areas where think tanks can contribute new insights and help leaders around the world make an informed decision. So I look forward to more exciting discussion and dynamic discussion throughout the program. Thank you.
Wonderful. Adrian, back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Jong-Min, for sharing your views about the impact of COVID-19. I believe you've set the stage for the discussions today, touching many on the themes that will be critical as we move on to the next normal. I'd just like to say that two of the themes, digitization and regionalization, also came up a couple of months ago in a forum that area organized, where the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia shared their countries' experiences with the impact of this pandemic. And just like you, embracing this fourth industrial revolution technology came as a prominent approach. And to try to resist protectionism, keep the trade investment flows open, but perhaps on a regional level and not just to close down one's economy. So we're developing policy recommendations. So I thank everyone for attending and listening to this session. I hope that we can all work together to find solutions and to assure peoples in our countries of a not just normal, but a better future. Thank you. Back to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks to both of you for framing this discussion, giving us a sense of what is around the corner. Even though we may be too terrified to look, we must face those realities. And you have pinpointed and identified those trends that we need to be on the lookout for. I now turn the program over to the chair of the first session, Stephen Wang, who is the head of the Our Hong Kong Foundation, and he will be chairing the first panel. Stephen.
Thanks, Jim. This session is about social, economic, public health, and political impact of the COVID-19 crisis, particularly from obviously the Asia and the Pacific angle. We have a distinguished panel from various countries in the region to talk about this particular topic. Let me just introduce all these distinguished panelists. First, in no particular order, Karida Palpicha. She is the Regional Director for International Research and Advisory Service in Thailand Development Institute. So she would cover this topic from Thailand as well as Southeast Asia perspective. Our second panelist will be Wutra Chahuri.
Please mute your mics. Please mute your mics.
He is Wutra Chahuri. He is a director from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, India. He was covering the perspective from India. And we have the third panelist, Tatsushi Sonobe. He is the Dean of Asia Development Bank Institute. He will cover it from the Japan as well as the regional perspective. The fourth panelist, Henry Wang. He is the president for Center for China and Globalization. He would cover that from China perspective. I think our panel, again, will focus on some of the observations, identification, and analysis of the problems, and share some of the reflections and lessons learned through this crisis. Obviously, we have later panels to share some of the solutions. So may I first invite Karida to share her thoughts.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and good evening from Bangkok to all of you. Again, thank you so much to Jim for inviting me again this year as well. As Stephen has mentioned, I will be discussing on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Thailand mainly, but also with some references to other countries in Southeast Asia. Well, I was thinking, why was I invited to speak, first? I think one of the reasons is because Thailand is one of the countries that is able to contain the COVID-19 pandemic very well in Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, its economic growth this year will contract by most compared to other Southeast Asian countries. So, there is a trade-off there. And first, I'd like to, give you some reasons why the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is so hard on us, even though we have able to contain the pandemic. Well, because in order to contain the pandemic, we had to close down our borders. Thus, that means that no international tourists are allowed into Thailand. And Thailand is actually one of the countries in Southeast Asia that depends the most on tourism receipts from overseas. So international tourists brings us about 12% of our annual GDP or our annual incomes. So, as you can see here that, when tourists do not come, it affects Thailand very severely. The other big component of our GDP or economy is exports, and exports contribute to about 54% of our GDP. So when the global economy contracts, our demand.
Hello, Karina. Okay, well, we seems to have lost Karina from Thailand, so maybe we should move on to Rutra to sort of give us his perspective from India.
Stephen, thank you very much. Thanks, Jim, and it's a delight to be part of the 2020 APTTS. I'm just going to make 4 points and stick to my 6 minutes. The first point is, I think, much like many different parts of the world, it's impossible to de-link India's response to the health crisis from what is clearly the largest economic crisis that India has faced ever since 1947. In many respects, the economic crisis that we're facing today is certainly at par, if not worse, than the balance of payments crisis that India faced following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of context. India, unlike my previous speaker, I think it is safe to stick my neck out and say is that I'm not sure that the primary focus of the Indian government at the moment is actually to contain the virus. I don't think that is the case. And I say this for a couple of reasons, is that I think that there is a realization, not only at the union government level, but also in various state governments, that it is simply impossible to put in the kind of health restrictions in place to contain the virus, while at the same time allowing the economy to prosper. And I think that's a realization that's been internalized. And my sense is that India has now opened up. In most interstate travel with India, there is no or little quarantine. Markets are open, factories are open, manufacturing is open, and the whole idea is to push consumption up as soon as possible. So point number one is the health crisis cannot be de-linked from the economic crisis. India faces what might be called a compounded economic crisis, which is that there was a structural economic crisis in India pre-pandemic. There was a problem in the factor markets, it's land, labor, capital, problem in consumption. Growth was down. Growth is staggeringly down. It was just over 4% for financial year 2019 and 20. Compare that to 8.3% in 2017. So hence, at the turn of this year, prior to the pandemic hitting, the Indian government put in place various monetary and fiscal measures to arrest the slowdown, right? So the important point over here is that the kind of fiscal and monetary measures that other governments in different parts of the world have been able to put in place to band-aid over this crisis, India had already done that prior to the pandemic hitting, right? So it found itself in March 2020 in a classic compounded crisis. And the solution to that crisis is not just band-aiding its way out of it or finding ways in which it can survive over the next 1.5 years, but institute structural reforms in land, labor, capital, and essentially factor markets. The second point, which is slightly different, is in India's response to the health crisis. It's worth keeping in mind that there is no one India. You're looking at a response of 28 different states. Health falls within what's called a state subject. So the state of Uttar Pradesh, that has a population of 200 million people, by law and by the constitution, will devise its own health policy that may be completely different to the state of Bihar, which it shares a border with, which makes interagency cooperation and federal structures very difficult. And that's essentially a federal constitutional problem in managing the crisis in itself. Having said that, where the central government, I think, was very good, and none of this can be taken for granted, is in a simple case of what might be called strategic communications or messaging. From day one, the government was very clear that in order to avoid COVID-19, it's about WHO guidelines, it's mass its sanitization, its social distancing. Now, ordinarily, it would seem a bit passé to make this point, but when compared to the United States, France, Britain, where even the basic WHO guidelines seem to be matters of much debate, I think it is quite a success story in India that at least the very clear, simple public messaging has gone down not only in metropolitans, but certainly in the rural areas itself. The third point, very quickly.
2 minutes remaining.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. The third point, very quickly, it's worth keeping in mind that India will be a central story in the global eradication of COVID-19. 50 to 70% of vaccines for routine immunization that's bought by the WHO is produced in India. All the leading candidates at the moment for COVID-19, apart from Moderna, will be produced largely in India and then exported to different parts of the world. So this is a geopolitical problem as much as it is one of supply chains, distribution, bilateral relationships. And India is at the center of that, which brings me to the last point, is on geopolitics. India dealt with the crisis not only in a time of shifting geopolitics, figuring out how to absorb moving supply chains. It hasn't done a very good job on that. But it's worth keeping in mind that India to deal with this crisis with aggression, not only in the changing features of geopolitics, but also on its borders. And this is an important point. Is it dealt with a near-war situation, continues to do so, in the Ladakh sector of India, which is on the border with Tibet in China, as it deals with the largest health crisis that it has since its birth in 1947. I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks. Shall I invite back Karina if she is back to continue her chat? Maybe she's still trying to get back on. Maybe I would.
I'm here,
Okay.
Stephen. If you want me to continue.
Yes,
Wonderful.
please. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. It's raining hard here, so my internet got disconnected. But I'll just, continue where I left off, which is I was trying to explain the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Thailand and the reason why the Thai economy is contracting so much this year. Actually, we forecast a contraction this year of the Thai economy by around 10%. So that's pretty huge compared to other ASEAN countries. And one of the reasons is because we depend a lot more on tourism and on exports compared to other countries in Southeast Asia. So that those are the main reasons why. And of course, these have a lot of impacts on, especially small and medium enterprises and also on employment in Thailand. We have a program where, all banks were required by our central bank to allow their customers or their clients to not pay either the principal or interest or both to commercial banks. And guess what? There were about 1.1 million small and medium enterprises that signed up for the program. And the program will end actually this month. So after this month, we'll really see how many small and medium enterprises will be able to pay back banks and continue their businesses. And, as our keynote speaker has mentioned, this crisis will definitely create a wider inequality between large firms and small firms because banks are still willing to, lend to bigger firms, but not to small and medium enterprises. So we'll probably see more mergers and acquisitions in different sectors in Thailand, especially in the hotels and in the property sectors going forward. And of course, these have a lot of impacts on employment because small and medium enterprises do hire a lot of people. And, our estimates from the Thailand Development Research Institute suggest that there could be up to 3 million people who are unemployed this year. And of course, those are unemployed, but there are around almost another 20 million people who will be affected by this pandemic, meaning that their work hours will be reduced because they're either in the tourism related industries, which includes retail, restaurants, anything that relates to serving tourists, and also the agriculture sector, because we found out that 65% of agriculture incomes from households in agriculture, their income, 65% of their incomes actually come from non-farm sources. So, when COVID-19 hits, the non-farm sources of their income actually fell. And these refers to remittances from their families, who are kids who work in the cities, or when they themselves, go to work in the urban areas, when it's off season. So, you can see that this has a big impact on employment and on working hours and on incomes of people in Thailand as well. The only thing that's going to help. Thank you, Jim. The only engine that's still running is the government. So the government still has a lot of money to spend. If you look at the macro indicators for Thailand, we're still pretty strong, right? Our public debt to GDP is still low. The government can spend more if it wants to borrow more. It has only spent 4% of GDP, during this COVID crisis in order to combat the crisis, which is pretty low compared to other countries. So we have a lot of international reserves. So macroeconomic indicators are very strong. Our issue now is how do we spend the money wisely and also, so that it actually helps, people who really need them. I think that's the main issue here, rather than if we have the money or not. We do have the money. So, I just wanted to end by saying that, there is an issue here, and there is a trade-off, as I said in the beginning, between keeping infection rates, almost zero, and the economy really suffering. So I think in this next phase, given that the Thai government still has the money, it could spend more money, given that, we would really need to also open our borders so that the economy can also start running. But how do we do that, so that people in Thailand will not feel so scared that the pandemic will go out of hand if we allow foreigners to come into a country? I think that's the bigger issue that we have to resolve going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating contrast between Thailand and India. So next, if we can invite Tetsushi Sonobe to talk about from a Japan perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Steve. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me in this interesting session of this important summit. My organization, ADB Institute, is a subsidiary of a multilateral development bank for Asia and the Pacific. And I'm Japanese, so I talk about both Japan and this region, especially the Pacific, which is not covered by other panelists. The Japanese government, as you know, has not taken any powerful containment measures like lockdown, but it instead requested the private sector to voluntarily keep social distance.
Please, if you're not a panelist, please. Hello, whoever's talking, please mute your mic.
Okay, let me, continue. So instead, the Japanese government requested the private sector to voluntarily to keep social distance and lower the level of business activities. The control over the pandemic has been relatively okay in this country. This result illustrates how strong the peer pressure in the Japanese society is. And interestingly, this result has surprised even Japanese people themselves. And the Japanese people have also learned from what have happened for the last half year that the entire public administration system in Japan, both central ministries and local offices, and then high offices to the small clinics. So needs a revamp to improve the government effectiveness. Turning to Asia and the Pacific, there are small island states whose economies are heavily dependent on international tourism, such as Maldives in South Asia and Fiji and Palau in the Pacific. These countries did a very good job in terms of control over the pandemic, but their economies are in very bad shape. Helping them is an urgent issue for the international community. And then I would like to talk a little bit about what ADBI can do. ADB Institute, since the outbreak of the pandemic, ADB Institute has quickly conducted a survey of micro, small, and medium enterprises in 8 Asian countries, another survey of households also in 8 countries, and yet another survey of rural households in South Asia. From these studies, together with the studies done by ADB headquarters in Manila, we have found that different sectors within the economy have been affected by the pandemic to quite different extent, which means resources we need to move from one sector to another. For resource reallocation between sectors to go smoothly and to have good effects, there must be vocational training, including digital skill training. A challenge is how to provide such training programs for people who may not have digital skills, nor digital tablets, nor a good connection to internet while keeping social distance. So addressing such digital divide and promoting structural transformation of economies in the region is one area where ADBI will contribute through its research and capacity building activities. We have also learned from our studies that many business and households have actually benefited directly from the government assistances, including direct support to income and low interest loans, and also indirectly from macroeconomic counter-cyclical economic stimulus packages. This means that governments in the region face huge fiscal difficulties. That is why the countries in the region and the world have to strengthen the domestic resource mobilization, or DRM, and the international tax cooperation that address BEPS, or base erosion and profit shifting, and other taxation challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy. ADB Institute will help the government officials in the region acquire the latest knowledge, deep insights, best practices, and solutions about these important policy issues. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Sonobe. May I invite Henry Wang to talk about from China perspective? Henry?
All right.
Not here? Okay. May I also, while we're waiting for Henry, can I also invite some? Okay. While we are,
please go on.
Yeah. While we are inviting, waiting for Henry, may I invite some of the three of our panelists to talk about this, because we talk about social, we will talk about economic, we talk about public health. But one aspect seems to be missing from your comments is on the politics, the political impact of the COVID-19, because obviously, Kurita, you talked about the potential, for example, wealth gap and inequality as a result of that. The government's expenditure is going to goes up. With that, this sort of expansion of wealth gap and the increasing fiscal intervention, would that increase the sense of populism among the society? What is the implication of that to the politics? Would all these political establishment become more unstable in each of your country and area, please?
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to share my views on Thailand on that. You're right that this pandemic has created an economic crisis. That in every economic crisis, inequality seems to increase, and it's the same here in Thailand as well, which is probably why we're seeing more students coming out on the streets and expressing their discontentment about how the government is handling the country, and it goes even beyond that, right? I mean, beyond the government to other higher institutions in Thailand as well. So yes, it does have political implications on the country, but of course on the economic front, it's not impacting much at the moment. The student protests are not affecting much because private investors are not coming anyway during the crisis. Tourists are not coming anyway. So the economic impacts are not great at the moment, but going forward, if this continues and the COVID pandemic eases, when tourists are allowed to come back, that will be an issue.
Oh, thank you. Would you care to comment on some of the political implications in India?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think it's interesting because in India, what you see is a complete detachment from political support and leadership and economic performance, right? So most polls seem to suggest that there is still a decent degree of support for the central leadership in India, although it is very clear that economic performance across the board and the government's economic handling at this current point has been questioned, right? So you see that not just in manufacturing or in the organized sector, but you begin to feel that in the large unorganized sector in India, which is the largest employment sector across the board, from agriculture to different subsidiaries in manufacturing, etc. And I think that paradox is interesting. How that delta is going to be filled politically speaking, is a difficult one to estimate. Ordinarily, it would be through an opposition, through political opposition, that would be able to kind of make the best of that delta. But in India, you don't see that opposition at the central level. And that's primarily because the opposition party is, the primary opposition party, in all frankness, is all but finished in terms of being able to provide.
Rudra, you're muted.
Sorry, could you get that? Or was
Now
it just
you're
the last
good.
No,
We
we,
lost.
we missed the last 10
three-
seconds.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I can cut off there. Yeah, thanks.
Do you want to recap for us though, since we lost it?
Sure. So, no, just to recap is that I think there's an interesting paradox in India, which is this gap between high support for political leadership, which could at some level support the argument that Steve is making about the importance of populism and populist rhetoric in this time of crisis, and a very visible slide in economic performance. So this is not just economic performance that is not visible today, but it's real, it's visible, it's unemployment is rife, consumption is low, manufacturing is low, and there is very little hope that India is going to be able to absorb the supply chain diversifications that's happening. And I think that delta is an important one for both political scientists and economists. And I think a lot of it is explained because of the lack of political opposition in India, which has all but essentially collapsed.
Okay. Putra, may I, am I correct to get a sense from you that you are basically agreeing to or disagreeing to the government strategies of not doing the lockdown, not doing the containment, because what you're saying basically they don't have any options given the economic situation. Am I sensing that you are agreeing to that?
You know, it's a tough one to come out in the open and agree to a policy which basically suggests that containment is not a priority. But yeah, you know, to be honest, how else do you get this economy moving? I mean, the United States has a population of 320 million people. It has 7.8 million cases. India has a population of 1.4 billion. At the moment, it has 7.2 million cases. Even if you take that at 10x, so say the liberal consensus is that the government estimate is too low. And even if you were to say that it's 10x of the government figures, I would still say, what option do you have than keeping the economy open? Because it's too big a country with too low state capacity to manage voluntary responses to a health crisis and containment, and at the same time manage a skillful opening of the economy. I'm afraid it is one of those blatant either-or situations.
Okay. And finally, can I turn to, we have 1 minute left, I think. Can I turn to Mr. Sonobe to comment on the Japanese political fallout from this COVID-19 crisis?
Oh, in terms of the political stability, there will be no change. But possibility is that the local governments may have more power, and the delegation of the power and the resources from central to local, which may take place in future. Because what the local governments have done makes better sense to the people than compared with what the central government. And then the local government, some local government leaders are very good at communicating with the people, while the central government leaders are not so much.
Great, thanks. I think, Jim, we have a good session talking from Thailand, Southeast Asia, Japan, and India perspective on sort of the COVID-19 crisis, on social, economic, public health perspective. So thanks for the panelists. And I hand it back to you. Yes.
Sorry, Henry, we have to move on. Unfortunately, we can try to add you at the end, but we have to move on. All right. We now have panel 2, Richard Vilsecki, who's coming from us in the middle of the night from the East-West Center in Hawaii. Richard, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Aloha and welcome to all from the Center of the Pacific at the East-West Center in Hawaii. The purpose of this session is to provide a regional overview, again, of specific policies and programs that have been developed to respond to the social, public health, political and economic impact of COVID crisis. We have an excellent group of panelists to talk this morning. Let me quickly introduce them and we'll get straight to it. From Vietnam, we have Nguyen An Dong, Director of the Department of General Economic Issues and Integration Studies at the Central Institute for Economic Management in Vietnam. Be followed by Mahfouz Kabir, Research Director, Bangladesh Institute of International and Strategic Studies in Bangladesh. Third, Megumi Muto, Deputy Director of JJICA Ogata Research Institute for Peace and Development in Japan. And fourth, Sokham Pek, Executive Director, Cambodia Development Resource Institute in Cambodia. And finally, Dong Wang, Deputy Director and Executive Director, Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding from Beida, from Peking University in China. Again, welcome to you all. And when we start with our Vietnamese colleague.
Thank you, Richard. Before I start.
Yes, please.
Before I start, I would like to thank Jim and his team for the continuous work. So we have the event today. I'll be very brief about the topic for the session 2. So with 4 main points about what we should do in the road ahead. The first thing is we need to seriously rethink about the incorporation of the Sustainable Development Goals in our policies. And with that, I think we can there could be a couple of ways for each countries, each region to follow. The first one can be that we leverage on the pressures from the international commitments. We are part of the UN SDGs, and some members are signatories to the new generation FTA, such as the CPTPP or the FTA with the EU, and it covers the chapter of the trade and sustainable development. So it implies commitment, and we can leverage on the pressures from those commitments passively. But there's another way we can adopt the work towards sustainable development goals unilaterally, and with that we can take the active stance, and we can encourage the people to and increase the people's confidence in the policy approach. And for that we should incorporate the SDG work, not just in terms of the work after the crisis, but we need to pursue that one straight away, even during the plan of the economic recovery. Having said that, we could also refer to the recent report by the McKinsey Global Institute, which evidenced the fact that if we work on reducing gender disparity even now, rather than waiting for the crisis to be over, then the benefits to the global GDP would be the largest. So in that case, we also think of empowering women in the sense that that is a driver for economic recovery, not just a political reward during the time of economic difficulties and public health crisis. My second point is that we also need to promote further work on the digital transformations. All countries in the region have been talking about that. There's no doubt about that. And the enterprises are taking measures to promote the digital transformations. But there need to be parallel effort by the government and also by the think tank. And because if we say the companies are moving on to digital platforms and all the officials, the government agencies are still working on the paper basis, then that's not going to be helpful in the economic recovery and the digital transformations. And also in another areas is that we need to engage the SME in the digital economy. And with that, the viewpoint is not just about inclusion. I mean, of course, the SMEs in the digital economy is about inclusion, but we should also think that the most of the startups are starting with a small and medium size, and they are the source of innovations. So promoting the SME in digital economy is also an approach toward the harnessing innovations rather than just increasing or promoting inclusion. So that is the second point. The third point is that we also need to improve awareness and capacity to act at the community level. And with that, one of the measures is that we need to use the digital means for tracing, for healthcare delivery. In Vietnam, we had a very good experience with this in the past few months with the digital platform for the digital for tracing the case of COVID-19, and that has been very helpful. And we have to forgive some of the privacy in these issues. And then we also need to build capacity for using the simulation model at the micro level, so we can assess the impact of the public health crisis. And we also need to build on the community-based monitoring system, including the early warning crisis, so we can quickly detect the cases and the source of crisis at the community level. And my final point is that we still need to foster international cooperation. There has been some argument about the loss of the confidence in this context after the COVID-19, but and then we need some concrete actions to revitalize the international cooperations. And with that, I think we need good examples, and I think the forum today is one good example, but we need more of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great start. Now we can now turn to Mahfouz Kabir. Can you unmute, please? Mahfouz, you have to unmute your microphone.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks Jim and his team for inviting me. Focusing on three major aspects of the impacts of COVID and how the way out. The first one is the economic impact of COVID-19. So, and Bangladesh was growing very well over the last couple of years. The GDP growth rate was about 8%, and in the last fiscal year, in fact, the fiscal year of 2019, it was 8.15% of growth, and then Bangladesh was in fact dreaming to achieve double-digit growth in the last couple of years, in the next couple of years. But unfortunately, in this fiscal year, the last fiscal year, it was 5.24%, which was the lowest over the last 10 years. So it's really, in fact, awful situation for the country's economic growth. And even though the World Bank has projected that the growth rate would be only 1.6%, but compared to that, the World Bank's projection, I think the government is in a comfort zone in terms of its GDP growth. But if you see the growth of the other, in fact, sectors like the manufacturing sector, which is regarded as one of the pillars of the economy, so it grew, in fact, at 5.84%, only about 6%. But over the last decade, so the growth was about 10%, and in the last fiscal year, it was 14%. The growth in the manufacturing sector. So and manufacturing sector provides a lot of jobs in the formal sector. So it created a contraction, and the heavy contraction. And if we see the other sectors like transport and communication, which was the hardest hit, I would say, and then community and social services, bank and financial intermediaries, and tourism, wholesale and retail trade. So all of the sectors, most of the sectors in the services sector and the manufacturing, so was affected by COVID-19. And in terms of job, so even though it was an estimation, so the PBS, the Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics, it has not come with the statistics, but in some of the studies, so it found that about 13% jobs were lost. So, and another estimate was that 16.4% new poor was added. So, and it created a huge pressure on the government in the public sector. So now the deficit is 6% of the GDP. So, and there are other social effects like reverse migration, and migration from cities to rural areas. So, and educational institutions that closed, and it created a lot of pressure on the young mind. And NGOs, basically a lot of, in fact, thousands of NGOs, they work with the rural people, the grassroots people. They are facing serious challenge because they depend on the donor money, revolving fund, and the loan from banks. So they are again on big challenge. And for the in fact think tanks, there are a lot of in fact pressure. Like I mean the studies they are doing, the action research they are conducting. So these are under pressure. So and they are also depending on the in fact donor money like World Bank, IMF, ADB, UN system, USAID, UKID. So they actually fund the in fact the NGOs and the think tanks. So and since their activities are not being conducted as before, so they are under huge pressure. So that is and what are the actions that we need to in fact take. So definitely Bangladesh government has taken has showed prudence in terms of not spending so much on the social protection, even though the ongoing social protection activities are going on, but still I mean they're not that significant. But it wanted to revive the people's capability through credit packages. About $1.15 billion credit package was in fact initiated. So and the,
less than 2
in fact
minutes
the manufacturing sector and other, yeah. So other sectors they are trying to revive, but still the sectors like I mean the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, doing very hard. So and that's very obvious. So because I mean the one reason is that lot of them get capital, so it's very difficult for them to revive. So that's a big problem, and they need to get money from the banks and formal financial institutions. So that is also a big challenge for them. So now what need to do? So the government has to take, in fact, adopt a special measure from through the banks so that they get the credit. That's definitely, and the MFIs, the microfinance institutions and NGOs. So they also need special, in fact, support from the government through banking channel, because even though there is a credit package for different sectors, like I mean, especially the manufacturing sector, but the NGOs they also take loan from the banks. So and it's really important for the government to design a special package loan programs for the NGOs. So that's required, and the hybrid financing is required. I mean the government and donor collaboration is required to in fact support the studies and to support the different sectors of the economy and society. And there is a need for global pool of funding. Like I mean IMF has declared $10 billion for the government, but the other sectors like the social sector, the NGOs, the research institutions, so they need support. So there should be a global pool of funding. So these are from my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kabir. Now we go to Japan with Megumi Muto.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this exciting group for the first time. My name is Megumi Muto, and I come from Japan International Cooperation Agency, which is the development agency of the Japanese government. So I was going to talk not about Japan, but how Japan approaches development in response to this COVID-19, not just for the research institute, but JICA as a whole. The first response was in water and sanitation for prevention. More than
recording is on
in the world lack access to water and soap. More than 1 billion people in the world live in urban slum areas. And in that context, surprisingly, in several contexts, there are no water facilities in hospitals, schools, or transportation hubs. So we started to work with water utilities to address these issues. For example, the Pakistani WASA. So that's the first area. The second was assuring liquidity and budget support to countries to help prevent the macroeconomic stability and prevent the instability, with components covering prevention and building back better, in close collaboration with NDBs and Asian Development Bank in particular. The third area that we are working and accelerating is health sector, including direct measures such as expanding hospitals, labs, and strengthening health systems. One good example is a PPP hospital in Cambodia. Both public and private sector are joining hands. The further works in the horizon are for the more vulnerable, with focus on building back better and resilience. In the areas of agricultural supply chain, informal workers, children out of school, and interestingly, we are looking into vulnerabilities of migrants in Japan, conducting interviews for these people. And then also we're looking at the consequences of decreasing remittances in rural contexts, for example, in Philippines and Tajikistan. Last but not least, we are engaged in these things under the banner of human security, as well as free and open Indo-Pacific, where social contracts and expectations among the citizens and the state aspire to be democratic, accountable, under freedom and rule of law. There are many versions of how these elements are manifested in this region. We as researchers come practitioners at the JICA Research Institute, we are trying to get out of our technical silos and reflect on the interplay between the socioeconomic fabric and the fighting for COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that quick summary and very effective. Thank you very much. And now we go to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Sokan Peck. Are you there? Have we lost his connection, Jim?
Yeah. Hello, I'm here. So, good evening. From Cambodia, let me look at a few recommendations and issues. We understand this about life and livelihoods. In Cambodia, there have been a lot of discussion about can you enjoy livelihood without life, without good health, and also looking at how best we can address the issues. As we all understand that this pandemic it's not the first time in the history. Maybe we did not remember what happened 100 years ago with the Spanish flu and other things. But we do remember that other diseases like SARS, Ebola, bird flu, and several others. So it looks like they are going to happen very often. And this also brings us to the next issues about how we are going to deal with that as a global community, because at the moment, because of that so worry, the country prefer to close the physical border, to prefer to look at self-reliance or put out their own self-efficiency in terms of food and other that impact the livelihood and also the life in other countries. So when I look at the recommendation of the working group number 1 on public health and others, I really like a recovery plan that should be built around the human or the person or people, and then had to be built, had to be informed by preparedness and resilient country assessment. This resilient and preparedness assessment should not only focus on the public health sector only, but they really need to focus on other sectors like agriculture, tourism, industry, issues like climate change, social safety net, resilient, and then back to livelihood again. So this is the issues of recommendation number 1. Number 2, I also look at the recommendation of the working group number 2, and I really like the idea around preparing national and international strategy for economic recovery and revitalization. Yes, for me, if this plan had been prepared in Cambodia CDI, as one of the think tanks, have been involved with the government in thinking about what would be the best recovery plan in the country or maybe the region or globally. And we all be looking at that. Maybe it's important to think about we need to invest in people. In people.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah.
Yeah. In people, especially investment in workforce development, in competency and skill, as mentioned by Jim earlier, that this tech savvy, that is a Cambodia economy used to be based on labor intensive. And now it looks like that it's just building on skill set and technology. That is important in terms of investment. And then social safety net. This pandemic showed that the social safety net become the biggest issues, especially those who work in the informal economy. And then let me move on to the next one. Trade investment are the key so far and that drive the Asian growth.
Minutes remaining.
Okay, yeah. So my recommendation would be, we rather than moving toward protectionism, nationalistic idea, we should move and build and maintain this multilateralism, especially this United Nations governance structure, public health structure, and those are the multilateralism should be the norms for the new economic or global order, public orders. And my last question, my last discussion would be around we need to address the issues about debt relief program, as a lot of poor countries are now in debt and may not be able to pay it. And maybe there's some discussion already among the World Bank and other on that issues. And the last question is about the role of the UN and the government. We see, a lot of us see this COVID-19 just show us the failure, maybe in science, communication with the policymaker. So that we need to actually focus more on how the scientific information will be used, how fake news or disinformation can be prevented. And those are the things that I think that we need to focus in coming forward in terms of to have access to information. And they want to know if this information is reliable, and policymakers need to use them. We don't have perfect knowledge, but we can have something that can build the policy around it. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
And thank you. And now we turn to Dong Wang.
Thank you, Richard. And I'd like to thank Jim again for inviting me to this very important, exciting gathering here. Today, I recall that I read in the news that there are actually 347,000 newly confirmed cases globally. And this is actually the fourth day in a row that more than 300,000 cases are confirmed on a daily basis. So I think this truly shows that the COVID, the pandemic, is now a new normal. So I think that COVID is an urgent wake-up call for international cooperation, and the concerted efforts of all countries are crucial to the success of the fight against the pandemic. In my short remarks, I will quickly address two major aspects of the COVID crisis, namely public health and food security. And then I will briefly talk about the implication for globalization. So first aspect, global public health, a couple of things. Number one, I think countries around the world should cooperate in pandemic prevention and control, medical treatment, research and development of vaccines and specific drugs, so as to open source information and share drugs results globally. Number two, I think we should also pay particular attention to the vulnerable groups in this COVID crisis. For example, the elders, given the fact that elders are actually among the most vulnerable to the threats of COVID. Next week, my institute, IGCU, will jointly launch the 2020 book on the elderly.
Please turn off your mic. Please turn off your mic. All right.
Okay. Okay.
My booming voice has been heard.
All right. Thank you. So I'm back. So I was going to say that next week my institute IGCU will jointly launch a blue book on elderly health in China. Among the many issues we are going to discuss are including how we should improve the public health system's readiness to minimize the risks of the elders to COVID. Number three, to support international coordination mechanism with WHO and other international organizations at their core. I think it is necessary to pool the wisdoms and strengths of the world together, enhance the effectiveness and confidence of the global fight against COVID, and solidify the foundation for comprehensive global governance to jointly respond to different challenges and secondary humanitarian disasters. And second aspect, global food security. I think the COVID also highlights the potential risks of a global food crisis. In order to tackle the potential global food crisis, countries need to strengthen international cooperation and coordination to create favorable conditions for promoting global food security. And I think there are a couple of things we can do. Number one, the international community should jointly take urgent actions to ensure the smooth flow of the global food supply chain, jointly maintain food supply and price stability, and reduce tariff barriers. And number two, countries should support World Food Program, the food agriculture organizations, and other agencies in playing their unique coordinating roles and leadership roles and actively providing humanitarian assistance to relevant countries to prevent mass starvation. Number three, global food trade should be unimpeded and the unilateral sanctions should be removed as soon as possible. Number four, to support the developing and low-income countries, especially the rural communities and family farmers, to improve their economic performance, resilience, and sustainability, food security, and nutrition. Lastly, implication for globalization. Many analysts actually cite COVID as the evidence that so-called deglobalization is on the rise and the globalization is coming to an end. However, I believe that the pandemic will not end the globalization. In fact, the process of globalization and global governance system will be reorganized, renewed, and readjusted. This is a process that I called reglobalization. So in short, I think we need a more inclusive reglobalization process to confront the common challenges of humankind. And all parties should make joint efforts to foster international cooperation, to pull through difficulties together, and eventually to defeat COVID pandemic. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dong Wang, and thank you to all the panelists. We've seen how the COVID-19 crisis has really acted as a catalyst to make us look even deeper or more comprehensively at issues we've looked at for years. And through panel discussion today, I've really proved that, whether it be human dimension, infrastructure, global supply chains, what have you. Thank you very much. And Jim, turn it back to you.
Okay, and I turn it over to our final panel discussion, in which a set of former policymakers and think tank executives and scholars will call us all to action, drawing on the presentations that have been made and some of their own thoughts based on the research and policy initiatives in their home countries. I now turn it over to Samir Sarin, president of the Observer Research Foundation in India. Samir?
Thank you, Jim. I hope I'm audible.
Very much, very clear. Two
Great.
quick things. If you have questions, we urge you to use the chat function, and also, which I've had to do through my booming voice, if you are not a panelist or speaker, please mute your mic so we don't hear your dogs and family and others in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I think that sets us up very nicely for the final session, which is from ideas to action, where we really want to bring together the various conversations we have heard over the past 1 hour and share with all of us in this community here some pathways to implementing some of the great thoughts we have heard into action that is implementable on the ground. Now, I think there are three big stakeholders and collectives that need to be moved to make this happen. The first, of course, is that any good idea must have an owner, be it the corporate sector, be it the government sector. How do we make good ideas find good owners of those ideas? And I think that's something that we need to start thinking about as think tanks. The second, of course, is that once you have an owner and a good idea, how do you make it popular? How do you make people buy into that project? We need community support. We need the citizen participation. We've heard from various speakers about corporate sector and private citizen collaborations and government and private citizen collaborations. We need to build a community that will buy into that project. And third, and most importantly, of course, how do we fund it? How do we raise resources? How do we build coalitions of capital? How do we direct money towards most important activities? Now, all of this has to be done in a framework, as we have heard this morning, afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are sitting. It has to be done in the context of an international order which is not necessarily functioning at its best. The multilateral system is failing or flailing at the very least. We have to do it at a moment when nationalist politics is upending efficient decision making. And we have to do this at a moment when we are confronted with micro challenges in different regions. We heard about Thailand and its challenges. We heard about India and its challenges. We heard about Japan and what it is up to. Different countries have different ideas. How do we stitch them together into a coherent international movement that can respond to the pandemic and, of course, restore the economy? Now, I must personally make an observation, Jim, and this is something you may have noticed as well. Since I've been part of your journey in building this exercise, I have noticed that for the first time, health has taken a backseat. Most of us have spoken about economic challenges. Most of us have spoken about vulnerable groups. Most of us have spoken about SDGs. Very few have focused on a persistent and continuing health challenge. Very few have focused on delivery of vaccines or delivery of treatment protocols that can respond to the health challenge as such. And this is something which is extraordinary. Have we reconciled with the health challenge, and have we moved beyond the health challenge? Are we making a mistake in jumping the gun? These are some questions we need to think about as we move from ideas to action. We have a very talented panel to respond to these posers. We have Kuni Miyake, Research Director, Canon Institute for Global Studies, Japan. We have Celia Reyes, President of the Philippines Institute of Development Studies. We have Simon Che, Chairman of the Singapore Institute for International Affairs. And we have Philippe Vermont, Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I would request you all to take 3 to 4 minutes in your opening interventions, and I might come up with a follow-up question if we have time at the very end. And I want to bring in Henry Wang towards the closing part of this session. He had technical problems joining in earlier. We will certainly want to hear from him. He completes the Asia Pacific community as far as this particular event goes. So Celia, let me start with you. We heard about the vulnerable groups, the older populations, the marginalized communities earlier. I want to know from you what could be the idea to implement the issue of safety nets and protecting the vulnerable groups. How are governments and think tanks going to partner to do it? What is the role of different layers of national and local governments to be able to build monitoring systems. Celia, over to you. You have 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Samir. In addition to the health-related costs, the economic impacts have been severe. And because of the nature of the shock, many countries have had to close their economies. Consequently, the global economy has contracted. Experts project that the global economy will decline by 5.2% in 2020. And assuming that the vaccine will be available in 2021, the global economy is projected to grow by 4.2% in 2021. Not enough to bounce back to its 2019 level. With the economic downturn, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to push between 88 and 115 million people into extreme poverty in 2020, setting back poverty reduction by around 3 years. This is according to the World Bank. What is also very important to note is that while the pandemic would have pushed millions into transient or temporary poverty, unless there are adequate programs to help them recover quickly, these temporarily poor people may become permanently poor. Many lost their jobs or closed their businesses during the pandemic. For those who have savings and assets to tide them over during the crisis, the income losses from business closures and retrenchment would be compensated by drawing from savings or converting assets into cash. When the economy recovers, they hopefully will reopen their businesses or find new jobs. Thus, their poverty will be of a transient or temporary nature. Unfortunately, for those who do not have savings or assets, such as the poor and the near poor or those just above the poverty line, they might have to sell whatever productive assets they have. Thus, when the economy enters the recovery phase, they may not be able to reopen their businesses, usually in the informal sector, or find new jobs. Whatever family enterprise they might have before the pandemic, they may find it more difficult to recover if they have sold their productive assets. Thus, they may find themselves becoming permanently poor. Therefore, the assistance programs that would be provided are very important in determining the rate of recovery of the affected households and individuals. The think tank town hall meetings have identified some of the most affected groups by the pandemic: children and youth, the elderly, women in vulnerable conditions, migrants, and ethnic minorities. The report has also provided a list of recommendations. Let me add the poor as another group that is vulnerable to adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of their economic conditions, they have less capacity to deal with shocks. Thus, they run the risk of falling deeper into poverty. For children and the youth, the recommendations in the think tank town hall report include redesigning and strengthening social safety nets. It also emphasized that to improve social safety nets, it's also necessary to use innovation and technology for developing accurate solutions to identify the members of the target group in order to achieve better results of the intervention measures. It also recommends for the inclusion of social safety net strategies within countries' recovery plans as soon as health threats decrease. The recommendations mention the need to identify the members of the target group. This highlights the importance of data to be able to formulate and deliver effective safety nets. Again, for the elderly, one of the strategies mentioned in the report is to gather demographic data to increase preparedness. Governments need to rapidly generate population data that illustrates demographic risk, including the relative and absolute numbers of elderly in different localities and their living conditions. The issue is the lack of data to know who and where the elderly are and what their socioeconomic circumstances are. We find that the lack of data is a recurring challenge for responding to the needs of vulnerable groups during crisis. So what do think tanks do in this particular area? Think tanks can contribute to addressing the pandemic by providing innovative solutions to address these data gaps. In this particular case, think tanks can start examining the coverage and effectiveness of safety nets, and what are the data gaps that inhibit the effective implementation of safety nets. We need to bear in mind that though this pandemic may be one in a 100-year event, there are other shocks that may occur. Thus, lessons learned from this crisis would be very useful in disaster preparedness. In the case of the Philippines, we have seen that the government has realigned the national budget to provide testing and treatment for COVID-19 patients, upgrading health facilities and equipment, and providing cash transfers to the poor and affected groups, among others. It made use of the list of current beneficiaries of its conditional cash transfer program, which targets the poor. Unfortunately, such list does not include the new poor, those who fell into poverty because of the pandemic, nor those who were working in the economic sectors that were closed. Thus, these families and individuals were not able to benefit from assistance programs. If I just have a minute left, I think, is that it, Samir? what I'll do is I'll just mention that the importance of safety nets for vulnerable groups to help them cope with the crisis, and consequently the need to revisit its social safety net programs. And also a major challenge in implementing these programs is the lack of data to identify and locate the target beneficiaries. And I would also recommend a local monitoring system, such as the community-based monitoring system being implemented in the Philippines and piloted in other countries, to provide the backbone for establishing the information base for an effective safety nets program. And finally, linked with interoperable systems of other government agencies, this can support the basis for a well-designed targeted safety net program. So a good local monitoring system and database to be able to identify and locate vulnerable groups in times of shocks should be part of the data infrastructure for building better under the new normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. I think you made an important point about the new poor, about the need for a better use of data, local monitoring, and whole of government approach. Let me move to Simon. Simon, we have also heard today about one of the most important trends, which is regionalism, how regions are aggregating together, the gaps in global leadership, and certainly from where you are sitting in Singapore, how do you assess ASEAN and the role of Singapore in this particular context, the regional context?
Well, thank you very much for those questions, and thank you for including me in this global summit or regional summit. I take off from where you said that basically for ASEAN and the small countries, we have to learn how to work together and deal with this crisis as countries, as a region, and without the true global leadership we need from America and China for their own problems and their own contestation. Within that, I think one of the key points I want to share is that we do have to deal with the health problem still. We do have to work together to make sure that the vaccine that is coming will be safe and available to all over time. We have to make sure in the sense there is equity in our international distribution of the vaccine. Prepare for that too. We will need to start to think about investing in each other's health systems. Each country needs to do so, certainly. That's a wake-up call. We can't actually work on closing borders and keeping it to zero. We have to work on building stronger national and local health systems so there is ability to track, trace, and deal with the problems so we can go back to manageable levels rather than stay closed. And this is important because our region needs to reconnect. I think Europe has done quite a bad job this summer and the numbers have gone up. Asia and Pacific have done the reverse. Travel is still so very limited. We will need to find trusted hubs where the systems of transparency, testing, and trust are strong so that we can start to reconnect through these hubs and start business and exchange of people again. In this reconnection, we will need to make sure that vulnerable sectors, such as Celia has mentioned, are taken care of. The migrant workers, which are very much part of the movement of people in our region, will need to be protected especially. We need also, secondly, to deal with the acceleration. Previous speakers have talked about how the pandemic is accelerating changes. The new economy, the shifts of supply chain, they need to be made more resilient, and we must fight against populism and protectionism. Additionally, the acceleration of the climate. Now, this year we've had a sudden dip in carbon emissions, but this has been a completely aberrant shutdown phenomena. We need to actually address the climate so that carbon continues to be low even as the economy restarts, rather than going for return to growth at all costs. If we do that, we're setting ourselves up for the next major crisis. My third point is that in this effort to bring the region together, we will need to find ways that ASEAN can work with the non-ASEAN partners. ASEAN is only 10 countries in the region. Many other partners. And now I started off by saying we should do so without the Sino-American competition in mind. I do not mean that we can ignore China. China's growth will be phenomenal compared to the rest of the world. We cannot forget America, and we hope for a good, safe outcome from the elections. But in the aftermath next year, In the longer term, this crisis will be one that has to be normalized, and we have to find ways that smaller countries can work together. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think you made two very poignant points. Borders can only be open if we all have invested in each other's health systems. One country with infection can create instability in the whole region. So we will have to work together as a regional health unit to ensure that the regional supply chains work. You also mentioned about equity in vaccine distribution and access to vaccines. And I think that debate must start now if we have to be able to deliver to those who need it most at the earliest. And finally, you have spoken on the need to reaffirm faith in globalization, manage the questions of migrants. They are the flag bearers of globalization, protect them, the supply chains, and how to depoliticize them. And of course, the international order and the disorder courtesy, the two largest actors, and how maybe some of us have to work with them and moderate some of their impulses to create a more stable ecosystem. Let me turn to Kuni Miyake, Research Director from Japan. Kuni, you heard the second panel, you heard the morning conversations, the earlier conversations. What would your suggestions to the region and to the world be in terms of what we can do together to get back on track, to build back better?
First of all, hello everybody. Maybe you're getting sleepy for different reasons. Too early in the morning in Washington, maybe, or in the United States, and getting late in Asia. But I think friend Simon of Singapore, I think he
Tony,
is
if
reading
you want to
my.
provide a qualifier on your remarks, since everyone did not hear it earlier. That these are your institutional affiliation, since you have now been named to the current government in Japan. These are comments that are made on behalf of the Cannon Center.
Right. No, I'm speaking on my behalf because I'm a independent researcher as well. Well, I just wanted to make it short because people are getting tired. Simon was reading my memo actually. And it's very well written, and I just want to repeat what he said. Because Jim McGann asked us to come up with the concrete, workable, realistic sort of suggestions. So as a student of the international or global or strategic power game in this part of the world, I say there are good suggestions written by the working group 4 of the town hall meeting. So in those concepts, as you know, the supply chain or health cooperation and global socioeconomic cooperation and global platform for cooperation. Those are beautiful words, but unfortunately, they are facing some political obstacles. And obstacles are, I don't want to name our friends, but those countries which try to sometimes politicize this issue. So as long as some countries try to politicize this issue, we can't go ahead. So my conclusion is very simple. We need a forum independent from those politicizers, and some good have good international sort of platform with among the like-minded nations. I think that is ASEAN. I think ASEAN would be the most concrete, practical, workable team for us to discuss these issues, those recommendations. And we have ASEAN 10, then we have ASEAN plus 3. There are many forums related to ASEAN, and I strongly recommend the think tanks in ASEAN countries to work together and work on some details of those suggestions, but hopefully in the next ASEAN summit or in the next ASEAN East Asian summit or whatever occasion, please get together and come up with some sort of recommendations, we will join you. I think this is the most practical way to go ahead. Unfortunately, those obstacles will not go away, and we have to wait for the 3rd of November. We never know who's going to be the next president, but after that, we will start working something concrete, workable, and realistic, and fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuni Miyake. Not very optimistic today, but maybe you might change your mind after November 3rd, reiterating the centrality of ASEAN in creating a regional response to the challenge, and of course, highlighting the politicization of institutions as well as action that is being an impediment to collective responses to this challenge that we are facing, which is both health and economic in nature. Let me move to the final intervention for this particular panel. And like I mentioned, we'll try and invite Henry Wang to join us from the CCG. But let me first invite Philippe Vermont, Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. Are you there, Philippe?
Yes, I am.
How are you doing, Philippe? Over to you.
I'm good, thank you. It's good to see you and everybody. Hi, I'm Philippe Vermonte from CSIS Indonesia. I just want to add some points that are already mentioned by earlier speakers, especially Simon. I agree with Simon that number one, I think in the context of Southeast Asia, we have to cooperate in terms of upgrading our health system. Number two, because the capacities are different, the human resources are different, and then I think this is the time where when ASEAN countries can cooperate under the framework, for example, of the international health regulations that they set the standards, and then we can cooperate to fulfill that requirement so that we are prepared for the next pandemic if that ever happens. Number two, I think in terms of cooperation of vaccines, I think this is going to be a very difficult issue because, as you know, countries are betting on different countries or different consortium, and then it seems to me that at least in the case of Indonesia and probably some ASEAN countries, the governments also desperately betting on the availability of vaccines, so that then sometimes they ignore the health problem that they are facing because they are hoping that at least by the end of this year the vaccine will be available. Then they start thinking about the economy. But I agree with Simon that still the health problem is very significant, at least in the case of Indonesia. So we have, I think, to cooperate more on the health side on this pandemic. And actually, Indonesia, in the last foreign minister meeting of ASEAN, if I'm not mistaken, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong, Indonesia put forward a proposal that ASEAN should have a CDC-like institution in the Southeast Asian region, so that through that kind of cooperation, we can deal with infectious disease more effectively, something that is now non-existent in our particular region. So that is something that think tanks in Southeast Asia, and probably with the help of a more experienced country, can think about, and then spend our intellectual time to devise or to think about how we can establish such a regional measure in terms of cooperation in dealing with the infectious disease in the future. Number three, I think my point is that we have to keep the faith on multilateralism in the context of Southeast Asia. I think those of you who are not familiar with Southeast Asia, we have the so-called mechanism called ASEAN Plus mechanism. Because I agree with Simon, we cannot let our region and probably our international relations be defined by the rivalry between the US and China. So through this ASEAN Plus mechanism, I think we can cooperate in a more unilateral manner. ASEAN Plus 3, for example, I think Japan, South Korea, and China can cooperate with ASEAN. And then a lot can be done through this particular framework, I think. And also ASEAN Plus India, or ASEAN Plus ASEAN Australia and other countries, so that you can have a more unilateral mechanism that is probably more convenient rather than working through kind of a global and international institutions that can at times be too bureaucratic and too large, and then we end up with achieving almost nothing. Number four, I think as far as the role of think tanks is concerned, in the context of Southeast Asia, regardless of the scientific issues, the political issues at the regional level, we have to acknowledge that within country we do have problems. Differences, many countries I think facing differences within their society. They become even more polarized during the pandemic. And Indonesia, if you follow the news in the past 3 days, huge demonstrations against the new law that just passed by our parliament in order for us to recover economically more quickly. And then the demonstration broke out. And then I would say that in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we're going to see another surge of COVID-19 cases, because this all demonstrations completely ignore the health part of this, and then I think then the think tank, right? Yes, think tank can be a clearinghouse of issues and providing rational assessment, cool approach to problems. So we cannot afford to be partisan in this situation. And I would suggest, we have ASEAN ISIS. Simon is now currently the president of ASEAN ISIS group, think tank of a network in Southeast Asia, so that we can be that kind of clearinghouse for the government approaching more balanced approach to things, health problem as well as the economic problem. I think I should stop there, Samuel.
Thank you, Philippe. So let me quickly, before I close the session, ask any panelist to respond to one question that we have on the chat window. How can economic recovery be green? Has any of the countries, any of your groups been thinking about building back green? Someone mentioned the importance of SDGs, I think, from Vietnam. But are any of you looking at this moment to build back green, to invest in the green transitions, and to, in fact, create sustainable development outcomes along with the revision? Simon, I saw you raising your hand. Do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very important thing to do. Many of the steps can be allied to the immediate response for the pandemic. But I would say not just green, but sustainability. Because sustainability brings in much more the social dimension, and that's very important. The healthcare system I talked about. People are starting to raise health bonds as part of the sustainability bonds. ESG has become a very critical trigger for all of the investments that are being put into the region. And true financial centers like Singapore have become much more important to companies. So I'm a great believer that right now is a moment to move for green finance. The region of ASEAN as a whole wants a lot of infrastructure, but the governments, many of them, are short of money. Their budgets are being diverted towards the pandemic. So if their ambitions for infrastructure continue, the critical part is to try to mobilize green finance to build more sustainable infrastructure, more efficient ports, more resilient ones. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think that responds to the question on the window. I take away 5 important ideas, Jim, for you to take note of. Minilateralism and an ASEAN plus approach might be most durable as the G2 still finds a new normal. I think that is the political order that we must count on. Build ASEAN-wide institutions like the CDC and other health systems that will allow regional integration to continue and to be catalyzed. Invest in green transitions and make health resilience part of the sustainable development goals themselves. Think tanks should now see themselves, based on what Celia mentioned and what Philippe mentioned, as institutes that will measure effectiveness of solutions and to create assessments of policy while being politically neutral and impartial, and they should be serving knowledge, and that is the only client they should serve during this period of turmoil. If Henry Wang is with us, I will request him to come in and speak for a few minutes. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Jim with the hope that he would have noticed I have giving it back to him a few minutes before time.
All right. wonderfully efficient for you and the panel. I have reached out several times to Henry. He's obviously knocked offline, but I have suggested that he prepare his comments in a PowerPoint, and we will circulate it to all the participants and include it in the final report. And with that note, I would also add that I encourage all of you panelists to send your brief remarks to Emma and Alyssa so we can incorporate them into the Asia Think Tank Summit report. Finally, I would say, Samir, to your observation, some empirical evidence that in terms of the town hall discussions, in terms of the regional and global summits, and most other forums, public health policy think tanks, whether they are global or national, are totally absent from our meetings. And this pandemic has underscored and made us aware, as you have pointed out, the need to engage with that community. They are invited and are part of our database, but they did not show for the town hall in which there was and you led a specific session on public health. So we need to figure out why that's so and how we can engage them, because as you have all pointed out on a regional and global basis, this is not going to be the first time we are going to be faced with a public health crisis, and we need to prepare for the future, as some countries have, and that has paid big dividends in terms of their preparedness for the current crisis. I now turn it over to Dr. An from KDI, who is the director of the International Development segment of KDI. And I would point out that in a few months, KDI will be celebrating its 30th anniversary, and we are joining with them to have in 2021 the Summit for Asia in Korea to help celebrate their 30th anniversary. So without further ado, Dr. An, I turn it over to you to lead the charge and call for action in terms of the think tank community in Asia. A tall responsibility, but you have strong shoulders, and I'm sure you can bear it and lead us forward.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, Jim?
Perfectly.
Yes. In fact, KDI was established in 1971, and next year will be our 50th anniversary, not 30th. So, and as a newcomer, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I am doing now. I'm working for KDI, Korea Development Institute, and I'm in charge of KDI Center for International Development. And we are running so-called KSP, Knowledge Sharing Program, on behalf of Korean government. So I will start by saying a few words about KSP, and I will move on to Korean government's response to COVID-19, and I will also talk a little bit about new challenges and responses from KSP in the middle of the pandemic, and then I would like to conclude. And I would anticipate that Jim would provide more forward-looking closing remark. Okay. KSP. The Korean government launched a knowledge sharing program in 2004, and so far, more than 1,200 projects conducted in cooperation with 84 partner countries all over the world, and 10 international organizations, including ADB and World Bank. And the demand for KSP has been rising persistently. Why? Probably because of Korea's unique position. According to Mr. Jin Yong Kim, former president of World Bank Group, he said that Korea is a unique position to share lessons with countries in many stages of development. And also, Jeffrey Sachs said that Korea still has the memory of being a poor country and has the benefit of a wealthy country right now. And that's an experience that Korea can and should share with its partner countries. Through KSP, we have had policy consultations in comprehensive areas, including public finance, industrial development, science, technology, and innovation, and social policies, including healthcare, employment, and environment. But here, now we are having Asia Think Tank Summit online, and think tanks are producing and disseminating knowledge. And we would agree that knowledge is the key for development. Actually, in 1966, when I was born, Professor Kenneth Golding, in his paper in American Economic Review entitled The Economics of Knowledge and the Knowledge of Economics, he said that development is essentially a knowledge process, learning process, which is real key to development. Last year, Paul Krugman, he delivered keynote speech to 2019 KSP Dissemination Conference in Seoul, Korea. He said, if global value chains are not going to be spreading as repeatedly as they were in the past, then we can have active policy to try and promote that. Public efforts like KSP have a very important mission to today's world economy, and it is more valuable than ever. Actually, it was before we had the pandemic. This year's KSP dissemination conference was postponed twice. It was planned to be held with ADB annual meeting. It will be held in November 24. And the keynote speaker for this year's conference is Professor Esther Duflo, and she identified this crisis as twin crisis with health crisis plus economic crisis. Now we should save lives and we should protect households at the same time. This unprecedented challenge, and Korean government response was summarized as three keys: testing, tracing, and treatment. And the case of annual confirmed cases have peaked twice. So we are struggling, and the crisis is not over yet. But now we have increasing demand from our KSP partner countries to work together on how to tackle COVID-19. So 20 and 21 KSP, we will have these projects with Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines focused on healthcare issues. Another challenge is that KSP was based on face-to-face interactions, but we cannot do it anymore. So online activities have become more important. And recently, Inter-American Development Bank and KDI have produced several interesting YouTube video files on infrastructure investment experiences like bus management, water management, and smart grids and smart cities. So we will share those products shortly. And our keynote speaker today's summit, Mr. Song, emphasized digitalization and regionalization, and this provides new challenges and opportunities, and I hope that we could take advantage of this. Finally, it was already emphasized that global crisis can be solved effectively only by global cooperation. I fully agree with that. Actually, March this year in Financial Times, there was a short article on the opinion page by Yuval Harari entitled "The World After Coronavirus." Let me read this quickly. Both the epidemic itself and the resulting economic crisis are global problems. They can be solved effectively only by global cooperation. First and foremost, In order to defeat the virus, we need to share information globally. That's the big advantage of humans over viruses. When the UK government hesitates between several policies, it can get advice from the Koreans who have already faced a similar dilemma a month ago. But for this to happen, we need a spirit of global cooperation and trust. Well, in his opening remark, Jim said that only the agile and able will survive. He also emphasized that for every crisis, we have an opportunity. As our challenges are global, so our response should be global too. And as we have a global crisis, so we have a global opportunity. I will stop here, and Jim will conclude this summit. I'm learning a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning more from all of you. Thank you. Jim, demute, please.
You're muted, Dr.
I have my computer is old and slow, so sorry. What was clearly demonstrated today by the array of quite spectacular speakers and their thoughtful comments is why think tanks matter. Clearly demonstrated by the suggestions, by the ideas and actions that are taken by think tanks in Asia. The reality is stark, and we must understand that reality, which is, when I look cross-sectorally, is that 25 to 30% of the institutions in travel and leisure, small to medium-sized enterprises, and think tanks will disappear, will not emerge from this crisis. And it is our obligation to our community that was emphasized here today to help each other survive, to come together, to cooperate, not only on the institutional level, but on the level, on the global level, and there in IR there's the notion of functionalism and neo-functionalism. And neo-functionalism is that there are transnational problems, and was mentioned in terms of deglobalization. It is a moment, as was mentioned, to re-energize multilateral international cooperation and to realize the unfulfilled promise of neo-functionalism that helps make the world work, that helps deal with these transnational issues. And I would contend, as I said, there will not be a new normal. There will be a series of abnormal events that will continually disrupt, and we need to be prepared as institutions to deal with that. Several have mentioned the community of think tanks and the important role that a community of think tanks in Asia can play in preparing for the economic fallout, for mobilizing to prepare for the next public health crisis, creating a regional CDC that will help prepare the region for these crises. And for good or ill, a number of the last pandemics and epidemics have emanated from Asia. And so it is, on Asia, and I'm not saying, China, but I'm saying that if you look at the facts, that is a challenge that is squarely on the region, will have a direct impact on the region, but will also affect the global community. And we need to get ahead of that, not behind it. And as has been mentioned, think tanks can be the catalyst for ideas and action, can be the clearinghouse, the objective experts that can help lead forward. We are clearly seeing what the difference between what experts say and those who I say to my students, PFA, which is plucked from the air. And plucked from the air does not provide the advice and the plan and way forward out of this crisis. A number of things that were mentioned that I would emphasize. One, upgrading the health system, creating a regional CDC, engaging, and we have to figure out how to engage health policy organizations